Well, the last couple of weeks we've been in this series called Leverage, and the concept of leverage is that in every one of our decisions, we either they're easy decisions or they're tough decisions. And if they're tough decisions, that's usually because we don't know which path to take, or the path we know we should take is the path we don't want to take. And so what I've been doing for the past couple of weeks is to try to encourage you to think about a few specific decisions and how we can apply some leverage to those decisions to make the right decision and to walk into it. Because the promise of God is that when you pick the path that He wants you to walk on, whether it looks difficult or not, it will lead you to a place of joy and blessing. So I want you to experience the life of joy and blessing by making some of these tough decisions. And so we're talking about some of this leverage and what it takes. Now remember, the principles of leverage we've discussed. There are three: stability, a pivot point, and a push in the right place. So stability, that means you got to have something outside yourself that provides the stability, the framework, so that you can make this tough decision. We looked 2 weeks ago at the fact that the Bible itself is your stability. That our brains change all the time. You know, something happens on TV and your belief system changes. Something happens in your life and your belief system changes. A friend gets injured and your belief system changes. A friend gets blessed and your belief system changes. Your neighbor wins the lottery and your belief system changes. You know, our brains change all the time, but God's word stays the same, okay? So if you want stability in your life, one place is not to think about your own thoughts, but to think about what God says to you. And so, that's the first thing. The second thing is this pivot point. Understanding that our brains are flexible, but we can flex them in the right directions. We can pivot them in the right ways, because after all, whenever you face a tough decision, one reason it's tough is that you don't have all the information. If you knew all the answers, why God was doing what He was doing, or why this situation happened, or where this path would lead you, if you knew all the answers, they would be a little easier. So maybe part of the decision-making is to pivot your mind in a direction where you learn what you need to learn. And then finally is the push. And for the past couple of weeks, I've been emphasizing this a little bit, that the push you need is from the people in your life. It's my job today to push you. And hopefully this week you'll be a part of a life group, and the people in that life group will push you just a little bit. And as we push each other, not just being mean, but push each other the right way for the right reasons, then all of us will have the leverage we need to make the decisions we need to make so that we experience the life God has for us. Make sense? So 3 weeks ago, we talked about the fact that one decision you need to make is to prioritize your church family. 2 weeks ago, the decision you needed to make was to prioritize God's word. Last week, Billy got really practical, and he talked to us about the decision we need to make to prioritize our responsibility to train others, to choose to train others, invest our lives in them. If you got kids, it's your kids first of all. If you don't have kids, someone else in this world knows less than you. And if you're like most people know less than you. Wait a minute. The math doesn't work there, but that's how we feel anyway, so just go with it. Anyway, try to find someone you can train. Invest your life into them, and don't be afraid of it. Today, we're getting really practical and really personal, because we're going to talk about an issue that is one of the key reasons people don't come to church. You probably, at some point in your life, have known or have been one of the people who has been asked, why don't you go to church? And your answer is what we're talking about today. Your answer for why you didn't come to church, or someone else, their answer for why they didn't come to church, is exactly what we're talking about today. And some of you here are going to be here today, and I'm going to talk about this, and you're going to leave, and you're going to be like, that's why I don't come to church. Because he talked about it again. Pastors are always talking about this. Now, we're not always talking about it because it feels like it, because whenever you show up, we know we need to talk about it. Anyway, that's another story altogether. So here's the thing. There are two reasons why people don't go to church. One, because they met a hypocrite, and two, because the church talks about money. So you knew it already, right? Now, here's the problem with money. We like it. And when someone tells us that we have too much, we don't like that. And when someone tells us that we need to reframe how we're doing with our money, we don't like that either. And so inherently, it touches us at a deep place, and we don't like people talking about it. I'm just going to tell you one of my stories, okay? And this story, I don't know how you're going to take it, but let's just go with it and see where it goes. About 4 months ago, I made a decision. My decision was I needed a MacBook Air. Pretty valid decision, right? I mean, Jake agrees. Pretty much everybody can make that decision at some point. No, so I was coming at a place where, I had recently shifted all my stuff over to Macintosh because, Microsoft just grates on my nerves and I want to kick it out my window. So I decided I wanted to shift. So a couple years ago, my mom gave me some Christmas money. My grandma, some people gave me some Christmas money, and I used that money to build myself a Hackintosh computer, a cheap knockoff of the Macintosh world. So it's not a real Macintosh, but it runs a Macintosh operating system. Yes, I'm a nerd, get over it. So I built this thing, and so I'm working on the Macintosh thing. I don't have any Windows stuff, but about 6 years ago, the church had bought me a laptop that ran Windows 7. And I was just kind of sick of the whole Windows world and everything. And I realized I needed to give that laptop back to the church and let them use it, let the church here use it for something productive, like in the welcome desk, people sign up on Facebook or something. I thought, let's just get rid of it. And so I've been working on my big desktop, but I don't have anything portable. And so 4 months ago, I decided the thing that I needed was a MacBook Air. They had just released a new version of it. It was all awesome, and it's sleek, and it's all awesome. And, so I needed it. So 2 months ago, I decided I was going to get serious about this, and I was going to try to actually find out if I could get one. And so I started looking on Craigslist, because even though I like Macintosh stuff, I'm a cheapskate. So I was looking at Craigslist to try to find any MacBook Airs that were for sale. And so I found one. It was $500, and I called the person or sent them an email or whatever it was, and the message I got back was, I don't live there anymore. Can you send money over there? And I was like, no. So after months, after about, it was probably just a couple days, but it felt like months, of me checking Craigslist and seeing scam after scam, I decided I was going to use my geekness to write a script on my computer that would automatically check Craigslist every 2 hours to inform me of any new MacBook Air that was listed on Craigslist. So then, check it out. For 4 weeks, I'm getting emails every 2 hours from myself on the newest MacBook Airs that have been listed on Craigslist, if there are any, and I'm tracking it. So for 4 months, I decided that what I needed was a MacBook Air. Then for 2 months, I was running this script that would tell me on Craigslist what the MacBook Airs were going for and what I could spend. And then about 4 weeks ago, I got one email. I got one email on a Sunday afternoon that a MacBook Air had just been listed for $800, $820, I think it was. $820 for the 13-inch screen. That's like $250 less than what Apple sells them for refurbished on their website. And I was like, this is awesome. This is the thing. This is the one. And I talked to Jen, and she's like, we're going to get a bonus from work in the next couple of days. And so, yeah, I guess you could do that and get a computer. And I said, but I'll get you one as soon as I can too, honey. And so she's like, okay. So I'm 4 weeks, I found this one. And so it took me about a week to communicate with this guy and to coordinate with him. I haggled him down to $780 instead of $820, and I felt kind of good. And so we agreed that, I don't mind too much meeting Craigslist people. I know I probably should, but I don't. So I planned for us to go down to Dairy Queen just south of Indianapolis. There's a Dairy Queen down there, and that's halfway between where this dude lived and where I lived, because I was searching all over Indiana for these things. So halfway between him and me, we went down there. I got to meet him, and I even brought my family because we're at a Dairy Queen, so let's get him some shakes. So we go there. I meet the guy, see the computer, shell out the cash. Now I own a MacBook Air, and it's like for 4 months, I've been trying to get this thing, and now I've got it. And then 2 months, I've been working on the strategy of how to get it, and I got it. And then for 4 weeks, I've been working on the strategy, and I got it. So it's just, I made the decision. I worked it. Why am I telling you this story? Well, it's because later that day, when we were done at Dairy Queen, I decided, well, instead of just going straight home, let's go to the mall and make a day out of it. So we went to the Keystone Crossing Mall. And do you know there's a new store in the Keystone Crossing Mall? It's called the Microsoft store. And I hate Microsoft, but I went into the store because they got nifty gadgets. And I looked, and I was in the store, and I saw, with my son, at least 4 little thin laptops that I thought, that'd be cool. And every time I said to myself, you just bought a MacBook Air. You just bought a MacBook Air. And I looked at the next one, and I was like, but that one looks cool. I went through, and I saw at least 4, and by the time I left the store, I was really working deeply on my soul to keep myself grateful. You know what I'm saying? I'm not just talking about buyer's remorse. I didn't want to get rid of my MacBook Air. I didn't want to give it up. What I'm talking about is greed. I saw something, and I thought, I could have that. So, we all know this. We need gratitude, but we feel greed. And we live in a society that is flooded with it. And I know I'm not alone. So let me show you a couple Bible verses. Because what I want to do is I want to give you some stability and let you know what the Bible has to say about this issue so that we can get ourselves on a firm footing to begin to pivot and get some leverage to make a better decision. Here it is. Mark 7:20 says this. Jesus is talking. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." 3 of the things in this chart refer to materialism: theft, greed, and envy. Most directly, the theft and the greed. Envy can be materialistic as well. But it's that greed word that was fascinating me. What does Jesus mean when he says greed? Because after all, check it out. Jesus is listing the worst of the worst of the worst of everything any of us would say was a sin. You know, we're church people, right? And the church has been widely recognized by our entire society as being somewhat prudish when it comes to sexual morality. You know, we happen to believe that people should be married before they get involved. We happen to believe that that's just the way God created the world. And you know what? Listed right there at the top of this list is our favorite one to rail against: sexual immorality. And so churches, Christians, especially in North America, have gotten all uptight for years about this particular issue. And we feel like it's the worst thing that people can do. Because after all, it's at the top of Jesus' list of all these evil thoughts and all these evil things. But you know what? We live in a society that we don't care if it's greedy. In fact, we like a society that's greedy, because the greedier our society is, the less people notice my greed. In fact, we live in a society where after the Twin Towers fall, the president goes in front of the whole population and says, "Get back to your normal lives. Shop." Because for us, everything is about the acquisition of the next thing. Greed. We like to pay attention to all these other ones, but Jesus includes greed as just as bad as everything else. What does he mean when he says the word greed? Let me show you. Jesus is speaking Greek at this time, or at least it's written down by Mark in Greek, and he uses this word for greed. The word is pleonexia. Pleonexia. And pleonexia is a word that I'm summarizing. This is my paraphrase of what it means. Whether anyone needs it or not, I want it for myself. Whether anyone needs it or not, I want it for myself. Pleonexia is a word that actually has 2 meanings that kind of dovetail with each other. Meaning number 1 is the acquisition of more and more stuff. I want more stuff. The desire for more stuff is our basic simple greed. But the second part of this meaning is that pleonexia also refers to it doesn't matter if I need it, and it doesn't matter if anyone else needs it, and it doesn't matter if anyone else has it. I want it, and if they have it, I want it more. So it's a very much selfish kind of idea. It's not just about the materialism. It's not just about the stuff. It's a very selfish idea. The thing is out there, and if anyone should have it, I should have it. And if anyone does have it, I should have too. Pleonexia is this idea. And when Jesus talks about greed, he's talking about that. Have you ever turned on the television to see someone holding something, talking about that thing that they're holding, and then letting you know that you could have it for only $9.95? But wait, there's more. and you said to yourself, I could have that. And you said to yourself, I bet that would be useful. Then you said, I think I want that. You talk to your friends and your neighbors and your coworkers for days. No, you don't. You talk to your wife for 30 seconds and say, what do you think? She goes, it'd be good. And now you need it. So you make the phone call and it comes. And the commercial changes. Next week, the guy's holding a different thing. And you can have that thing. And that thing is only $9.95. And you go through the same process. And every single day, it's the same thing over and over and over again. Someone else is holding something else, and they're saying that you could have it. And greed has just become part of who we are. And that's what Jesus defines as the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst of everything in society. Okay, so just to press this point home a little further, I want to read you some other passages in the New Testament about this. Romans 1:28 through 32 says this. Paul is writing about the worst of the people in the world. He says they've become filled with every kind of wickedness. Think about that. Every kind of wickedness. If it's bad, they've got it. And now Paul lists off all the possible bad things. Every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They even disobey their parents. Hopefully you were here last week to hear Billy talk about that one. They even disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Check it out. Specifically, Paul says every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. I look at this list and I say one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just isn't the same. Can you guess which thing is not like the other? Come on, can you play this game? It says every kind of wickedness. That's a general thing, right? Wickedness. That's the word you use when you're talking about a person who's bad, but you don't want to tell them why they're bad. Evil. That's a general term. That's the word you use when you want to talk about someone and tell them they're bad, when you don't want to tell them specifically why they're bad. Depravity. That's a word that you use generally to tell someone when they're bad, that they're bad, not why they're bad. Greed is a word that we use to tell someone why they're bad. Greed is a word that we use to be the specific, individual, tiny sin. We don't use greed as a general term. But Paul says greed is equivalent to wickedness, evil, depravity. These bad, worst of the worst kinds of words. Greed is one of those words. And yet by definition, it's ingrained in our hearts and our minds and our societies. It's there. Let's keep going. It doesn't get any better. Ephesians chapter 5 says this, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Because of what things? Because of immorality, impurity, and greed. Paul says that greed is one of the things that deserves God's wrath. Paul says that greed is one of those things that disables you from heaven. You've heard people say this before. I think I'm probably going to go to heaven because, I haven't killed anyone. As if that makes you a good person. I haven't killed anyone. I haven't stolen from anyone. And then those of us with the sort of Christian mindset, we're like, but let's talk about sexual immorality. But then we're guilty of it all ourselves, mostly, including in our minds, the way we think about people. And Jesus said, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery. So we're all guilty of that one too. But we don't talk about that one as if we're also guilty about it. But we never mention greed. Never. And yet greed is one of the things in this list that God says disqualifies you from heaven. He doesn't even say murder here. He doesn't even say theft here. He says sexual immorality, impurity, and greed. One more. Colossians 3, 5 through 6. Paul says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these things, God's wrath is coming. Once again, he talks about greed, and he adds extra stuff to it, calling greed idolatry. Anytime you're greedy, what you're saying is you're saying, God, you're not enough. There's something else. Jesus says you can't serve two masters. Either you'll love one and hate the other. You can't serve both God and money. The Bible talks more harshly about greed than it does about murder. Now, if you're like me, that should just simply scare you. But of course, I found my loophole. I remember when I was a kid, I learned the greed loophole. And it goes like this. My church had a box in the hallway. And in the box, there were shoes and stuffed animals and clothes. And they were all worn, all used stuff. And I remember talking to my mom. I said, Mom, what's the box there in the hallway with all the used stuff in it? Is that trash? And she goes, no, it's not trash. It's our missionary box. And I said, what's that? She goes, well, we take that stuff and we send it to the missionaries. So that either the missionaries, if they need it, they can use it, or if there's someone that they're working with in the town, they can give that stuff to the people in the town. And I saw that and I thought to myself, why are we sending missionaries all our used stuff? Why don't we ever send them new stuff? And so I said to my mom this, because I discovered the loophole. I said to my mom, I said, Mom, when I grow up, I want to be rich so that then I can buy new things for the missionaries and send it to them. But, in my heart, the period of that sentence ended earlier. Mom, when I grow up, I want to be rich. And you know why I know that second piece was just a cop-out? That second piece was me trying to find God's loophole. You know why I know that? Because today, I am a whole lot richer than I was when I was 10. And I know how I've spent my money. And I don't think I'm that interested in sending awesome things to missionaries. Because I'm greedy. I live in a society of greed. And according to God, that is just about the worst possible thing. And I need to find some leverage to dig this out of my soul. So I was studying this last week. I had an angle. I had an idea of what I wanted to do today and what passages I wanted to take you to. And so this last week, I was beginning to study them. A couple years ago, I did a series of messages called The Treasure Principle. And honestly, the first message in that message series is one that to this day I still listen to sometimes just because I need it. And quite frankly, as a pastor, being honest, I'm impressed with myself with that one. I think I did a fairly good job with that one. And so I listen to it now and then I'd be like, all right, that's pretty good. I like that one. And so I thought about just kind of re-preaching it for you this week. And I was sort of planning to talk about that kind of stuff that I talked about then until I learned the word that Jesus used for greed. And it changed something. Because that word shows up throughout the New Testament, in one passage especially, in a way that I hadn't expected. We're going to look at that one right now. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 15. If you're using our paper Bibles, it's on page 806. Otherwise, go ahead and jump there with whatever method you need to use to get there. But let me read 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 15. Now, set this up for you. What Paul is doing here in 2 Corinthians is he's already written, of course, 1 Corinthians. Now he's writing another letter. It's probably the third or fourth letter Paul is writing. We only have two of them, and that's why we call them 1 and 2 Corinthians. But Paul has planted churches. He's started churches throughout the ancient Roman world. And so as he's been doing that, of course, he's been traveling all over the place, and he's been meeting people who are not Jewish. But still, back in Jerusalem, there's a church. And the church back in Jerusalem had a very interesting thing happen to it. What happened to the church in Jerusalem is that, first of all, when the church first got started, they needed a lot of money. Because there were a lot of new people who joined that church from foreign lands, and they didn't have all their wealth and resources with them. They had been traveling through the area, found the church, and stayed there because they fell in love with what God was doing there. And so now they had a lot of extra people, but they didn't have all the resources. So the church needed to step up their game. And so the people who were wealthy, namely one guy named Barnabas, the people who were wealthy sold the stuff that they owned, took the money, pooled it together into the church, and then the church lived a communal existence with everybody so that no one was in the dark, no one was hungry, everyone was taken care of. The problem was a couple years later there was a famine in the land. And that made it even worse. And then a few years later, there was another famine in the land. And that made things worse. So that by the time Paul is done traveling all around the Mediterranean, starting churches, the church back in Jerusalem is impoverished and hungry and needy. It's just filled with poverty. And Paul says to himself, I have just reached all these people. And spiritually speaking, they owe a lot to the parent church, the mother church back in Jerusalem. But even more than that, it's just simply our duty to be nice, to be good, to care for our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so he starts taking up a collection. And for 2 years, Paul is telling people he's taking up a collection to bring some money, some financial resources back to the people in Jerusalem. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul tells them about the collection. Between 1 and 2 Corinthians, they made a commitment. They said, we want to help. Then also, Paul has talked to other people and told them that the Corinthians were going to help. And these other people got motivated. And now we're in 2 Corinthians, and Paul is trying to get them to make good on their promise of financial assistance. That's where we pick it up. Verse 1. There's no need for me to write to you about this service to the Lord's people, for I know your eagerness to help. And I've been boasting about it to the Macedonians, telling them that since last year, you in Achaia were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred most of them to action. But I'm sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you in this matter should not prove hollow, but that you may be ready, as I said you would be. See, what Paul is saying is, you made a promise. Now I'm going to send some people to you to help you get ready so that when I show up, there's going to be some Macedonians with me, and they heard about your promise, and they've given a whole lot, and they're actually worse off. We know the Macedonians were worse off economically than the Corinthians, and yet they gave abundantly. And so now Paul's going to be going with them to Corinth, and he says, if we get there to Corinth and you guys don't have money ready, that's going to be messy. Let's see what he says. Verse 4, for if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to say anything about you, would be ashamed at having been so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to visit you in advance and finish the arrangements for the generous gift you had promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given. Did you see the word greed? The same word Jesus uses for greed. The same word that shows up in Romans and Ephesians and in Colossians for greed also shows up in verse 5. And it is the word grudgingly given. You see, what Paul says is, I want you to be prepared in advance to give generously. And I want it to be generous so that it's not grudgingly given, but he uses the word greed. See, that might mean a couple things. On the one hand, it might mean that Paul doesn't want anyone to perceive him as greedy. He wants them to give generously, not as a generous gift, not as one greedily taken. Because the word given doesn't show up there. It's just, I want you to give as a generous, not as a greed. That's what he says, literally in the Greek. Generous could also mean blessing. I want you to give this as a blessing, not as a greed. Effectively, that's what he's saying. So he doesn't want them to give in such a way that he looks like a greedy person, but maybe it's also this. He doesn't want them to give that in doing it, they're displaying an attitude of greed. I'll give you what slips through my fingers. I'll give you the extra, what spills over. I'll give you a little bit while I hold back a lot. Paul says, I want you to give in advance, prepared well, generously, abundantly, so that it's not greed. In other words, Paul says that the solution to greed is generosity. The antidote to greed, I thought, was gratitude. I thought I just needed to be more thankful for what I already had, and then I wouldn't be so desirous of the other things. But as a matter of fact, what Paul says is the antidote is generosity. Generosity is the opposite of greed. And so then the rest of this passage, Paul tells us why generosity is so powerful. How generosity can offset greed. How generosity can be the solution, the leverage that we need to move beyond. Let's go ahead and keep reading. In verse 6, we pick it up again. Remember this, Paul says, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it's written, they've freely scattered their gifts to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. Now, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Twice in this passage, we're told we can get rich. Paul says, you will abound. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all ways, in everything, you will have all that you need. And then later on, he says, you will be enriched in everything. And he also even says this crazy phrase where he will say that God will completely fill your storage of seed and your harvest from your righteousness. In other words, God says to them who are farmers, their income, their money is their seed, their crop that they're raising. He says, you will have even more. And how do you become rich? How do you get this wealth? You give. You be generous. Now, at this point in time, this is where a lot of people shut off when it comes to the church, because they've already turned off their television the last time they heard some dude on the screen say this same kind of thing. The guy on the screen, he's wearing 4 or 5 gold rings, and his wife has eyelashes that can poke you. And they cry all the time, and they're asking you for money, because they'll tell you this. They'll say, if you send me money, God will bless you. They'll say, this is how it works. You sow a seed of money into my ministry, and then God will bring a harvest into your life. When I was a kid, I remember this guy was on the screen, and he was a lunatic. They did a 60 minutes expose on him, and they found out that he was just a fraud and everything like that. But I was on his mailing list for a while. He sent me I kid you not, he sent me a little packet of cement in the mail. He said, do this. He said, take this cement, mix it with water, pour it on your place of need, like your wallet, and then for a seed, send something from that to me. And God will bless you, because I've already blessed this cement. I was like, what? So, of course, all of us, we look at that kind of stuff and we say, no, they're just playing games with us. They don't need more money. They don't need anything like that. And so now, of course, we're in a smaller church. We're in smaller buildings. I don't wear golden rings except for my wedding ring, which, I'm not taking that one off. But so, we're in this smaller environment, and yet I still say the same thing. Well, A, they're wrong in the way they're presenting it. But B, there's a real principle here. You know why? See, there's something deeper happening here. And if you look at that verse, it says, verse 10, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed. And verse 8, and God is able to bless you abundantly. Let me just tell you what it is. God, he's a blessing kind of guy. It's wired into who he is. He just gives and gives and gives. He didn't need to make the earth, but he gave from himself a planet. And then he gave from himself life. And then he gives from himself over and over again until finally, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. God is just a giving, blessing kind of guy. And you know what? If he's a giving, blessing kind of guy, then he wants to do things that maximize his ability to give and to bless even more. When I built my house here in Lafayette, I didn't build my house. And I didn't pay the plumbers to put the pipes in. And I didn't pay the guy who was up on the roof nailing the shingles down. You know what I did? I paid the company. And the company paid the next guy. And then the next guy paid the subcontractors. And then the subcontractors paid the employees. At least I hope they all got paid, because I paid the company a lot of money. So I hope they all, down the line, got paid. But I didn't pay all of them individually. And you know what? God blesses you because He sees in you the responsibility and the responsible person who can bless others. God is a blessing God, and He blesses those who bless. That's it. He blesses those who bless. Since He wants to bless everybody, either He has to do it all directly, or He does it, and this is the way He chooses to, through all of us. God blesses you with something, and He intends for that blessing to be passed on to someone else. God blesses abundantly, and He blesses those who bless. This isn't a loophole. This isn't a way for you to cover over your greed by saying, if I give God a little, He gives me a lot. I want a lot, so let's give God a little, and then He'll bring me some more. This isn't a way of covering over your greed. This is a way of recognizing the blessings that God has blessed, and so I bless, so others can be blessed. So God will bless, so I can bless, so others will be blessed. That's what it's all about. As a matter of fact, you know that word in there that's translated generous? It can also be translated bless. That's it. God is a generous God, and He's generous to those who are generous. God is a blessing God, and He blesses those who bless. That's just the way it works. But there's one other piece. One last little thing that Paul mentions here. It begins in verse 11. We already read it once, but let's read it again. Paul says this: you will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Keep going. This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the service by which you've proved yourselves, others will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone else. And in their prayers for you, their hearts will go out to you because of the surpassing grace God has given you. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift. What Paul says here is that when you give, when you're generous to someone else, you cause gratitude in this world to increase. Because they see that. They receive the blessing, and they feel grateful for you. And they feel grateful for the gift. And they feel grateful for the God who passed it through your fingers. See, when we are generous to someone, the level of gratitude for God in this world goes up. The level of worship for God goes up. And you know what? On top of all that, once you let it go, guess what happens to you? Guess what happens to you? All of a sudden you realize, I didn't really need it. I'm still breathing. There's still food. I let this go, and I'm still okay. And at that moment, you begin to realize God's taking care of me. And then the next time God blesses you, you're like, I don't need this. God's taking care of me. And you begin to get more grateful for the God who cares for you than for the things you try to take care of yourself by. Generosity leads to gratitude. Generosity is the pathway to gratitude. See, it's not that I need to somehow muster up more thankfulness in my heart so that I'm not greedy. That's not what it's about. What it's about is that somehow I need to find a way to let more go so that if any more comes in, I'm grateful. And let more go so that whatever I still have, I'm grateful. And let more go so that even if I get to the place of need, I am now in a community of people who we know generosity, we know blessing, and if I happen to accidentally give too much away, there's someone else around here who can be generous to me. So that's what the family of God is really supposed to be about. You can't outgive God. Even if he doesn't bring it back into your checkbook, he can bring it into someone else's checkbook who knows how to bless you. That's just the way he works. Listen, I want to give you the leverage to dig the greed out of your soul. And I'm convinced that the key is generosity. So I want to give you a practical thing here at the end. Just one practical thing to challenge you, encourage you maybe, and move you out of where we are toward where we need to be. It's a very simple thing, but it's a threatening thing. And it's this. Practice 10% tithing. Now, some of you would be like, wait a minute, I've read the Bible. 10% tithing, that's all Old Testament stuff. That's not in the New Testament, really. I mean, we're never really told. Paul never tells us we need to do 10% tithing. He didn't tell these people 10% tithing. Hang on, let me tell you something. There are two kinds of giving in the Bible. Giving number one, there are no blanks for this. Giving number one is giving just because. Okay? Giving number two is giving to a cause. They're different. Two kinds of giving. The kind of giving Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians was mostly the giving to a cause kind of giving. But there's another kind of giving the Bible talks about over and over again. In fact, it talks about it more frequently, and that's giving just because. You see, the principle in the Old Testament is very clear. When God blesses, he overblesses, always. God never blesses you just enough. He always gives you extra. The problem is, we like extra. And we change our lives in such a way that we accommodate God's extra, and then we wait around for God to give us extra. But the Bible is very clear. God gives us at least 10% more than we need. And we know that because repeatedly he says in his word, when I bless you, take the first 10%, take the first fruits, take whatever it is, and bring that back to the storehouse of God. Bring that back to the temple of God. Take care of the ministers in your community. Take care of the poor in your community. Bring it back. That's what God says. 10%. And that's his minimum throughout Scripture. Some of you in this room, I know you've committed to the 10% thing. And it was a struggle for you at first, but you're now beginning to get in the mode of it. And I want to praise God for you and thank you for being faithful. But that doesn't mean you're generous. That just means you're baby stepping your way towards generosity. I look at my own life and I see greed just abundant on me. And sometimes I'm burdened by it. And yet I've been a part of the whole tithing thing since the day I was 5. And so now I'm stretching myself. I'm like, what's next? How do I, when? And it's emotional, and it's a struggle, and I know what that's all about, but I know I am not generous yet. I'm working towards it. But some of you haven't ever made that commitment. You're still working on I'm giving to a just cause. I see the church as a valid cause, and so I'm giving like I give to causes. A person calls you up on the phone and they say, hey, can you give to our school? We're raising money and we're selling these things. And you're like, okay, I'll give to that cause. How much do you need? Well, a calendar costs $20. And you're like, okay, I'll buy a calendar because then I get a calendar. That's a good cause. And they get some money. That's a good cause. And so we do the $20 exchange. Or maybe it's the paper, the Christmas wrapping paper that shows up, or the Girl Scout cookies or whatever. And so you give to a good cause because you're getting a good thing back in return. And that's what we generally do. That's called normal. That's not called generous, and it's certainly not called people who trust God. That's what this whole greedy world does. They give to a thing that makes them feel good, and they give in small amounts. For some of you in this room, 10% sounds like it's huge. And you have a hard time believing that God has given you 10% more than you need. Because you've already built up your life so much so that all of the extra margin in your life is taken up and then some. And there's nothing left. And so because there's nothing left, you feel like there wasn't anything there to begin with, but it was there. And you've just expanded your life into the bonus that God had given to you. And because you've done that, He can't give you the next bonus. Because you already have the bonus that was supposed to pass through your hands. God blesses those who bless. He's generous to those who are generous. So I encourage you, jump in. If you have to start out with like a 1% or a 2% or 5% thing, listen, I know I know that some people need some baby steps. But if you can just jump right on in, just see what God does. Do you realize in Malachi 3:10 that this idea of giving God 10% is the only thing in the Bible that God says, test me? The only thing. He says, here's the one thing I want you to test me on. Go ahead and give me back that bonus that I gave to you and see what comes next. See if I don't flood your family and your community with so much blessing you can't take it all in. That's what he says, Malachi 3:10. Some of us need to just get the guts and do it. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying, A, understand God's word says greed is as bad as it is. B, understand that generosity is your only hope. And C, I want to push you to do the 10% thing. To just see what God does, if he comes through, and how it works. Now, with all that said, I want to say one last thing. And this is why we're not taking an offering today. Because I don't want any of you to give under some sense of compulsion. Like, oh, we've got to make this offering big. He's just trying to get this one big. No. I'll give you a statistic. The statistic goes like this. Okay, so we live in a community called Lafayette. And the average household income in Lafayette is around $45,000. And we have 90 people, 90 families who have given to this church in the last year. That means if we had only 50 families who give to the church and are actually, regular givers to the church, and they were tithing and they only made the average income in this community, we would have $60,000 extra dollars now. Extra. Yeah, it costs some money to rent this building. It costs some money to pay staff salaries and things like that. We're not spending any money on health insurance right now. Not a dime. We're not spending any money. Well, we're spending some money on some social projects, but a lot of the social stuff that we're able to do outside these walls is because of just people who step up and volunteer and do stuff. As a church, we're supporting a few missionaries. And you know what? If we had 60,000 extra unaccounted for dollars, you know what we'd do? We'd paint these walls gold. No, we wouldn't. That's lame. I don't want to do any more improvements around here. We've already got our TVs, our lights are cool. I would like a better drum cage, because man alive. But that's all neither here nor there. If we had $60,000, how many people could we bless? How many homeless people could we get off the street? How many people could we feed? How many actual things could we solve? Do you realize that a Habitat for Humanity house, if we paid the entire thing ourselves, is only $40,000? You realize that? If just, check it out, if just the people in this church tithed, this church would be able to build its own Habitat for Humanity house for someone and have $20,000 left over to bless some people. So here's the last thing I'll say. I don't want you to say any more about the tithe that you're giving to God. And this is why. Because God never gave it to you to begin with. That's the bonus. That's the extra blessing that He's blessing you with so you can bless someone else, so that you can do some blessing work with it. And I'll be very clear. I believe this is the way the Bible teaches the tithes should be used. I believe it's the way it should work. And I'm going to be frank with you. You bring it here. And I'm going to be honest with you. When you do that, you are not giving to God because He gave it to you for His purposes in this world. You're using it for His kingdom, yes, but you're not somehow mystically giving it to God. What you're doing is you're giving it to me and my family, to this building, to Billy and Beth, who I believe should get a little bit more, maybe even some health insurance. That's another story. So you're giving it to specific things right now, but we could be giving it so much wider, so much farther, so much deeper, and do so much more. I don't want to coerce you into anything. And so that's why we're not passing a basket today. If you already came planning to bring, you already brought something, you've already signed the check or whatever, we've got a box outside in the lobby, you can put that in as you go. We've got a little black box on the wall, you can put something there too if you want. But I just want to leave you with this. God is calling you to step away from greed through generosity all the way to gratitude. And we can go there together. And it starts with a few baby steps. If you have any questions about this stuff, please talk to me. If you have any questions about how our church is using its finances, please talk to me. If you would like some things to change about it, please talk to me. If you think we're doing a great job, please talk to me, whatever. But we're all in this together. We're all in this together. Let's pray. Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.